Marcus Johnson, a seasoned pilot, finally took his seat in first class, ready to enjoy a rare moment of peace on the other side of the cockpit door. But when a flight attendant approached, her gaze held something unexpected, a glint of doubt. What unfolded next would stun every passenger on board, challenging assumptions and turning this ordinary flight into an unforgettable journey. Captain Marcus Johnson, usually a commanding presence in the cockpit, sighed contentedly as he sank into a plush first-class seat. Dressed in simple jeans and a casual button-down shirt, he blended seamlessly with the other passengers boarding the transcontinental flight from New York to Los Angeles. This was a rare luxury, experiencing first class as a passenger instead of the one piloting the aircraft. He took a moment to savor the soft leather that enveloped him, relishing the change in perspective. The summer heat clung to him, leaving a thin sheen of sweat on his dark skin, a small reminder of the humid New York day he'd just escaped. Pulling out a well-loved, dog-eared copy of The Right Stuff from his carry-on, Marcus couldn't help but smile at the irony, reading about the golden age of aviation while someone else took charge of the skies. As passengers trickled past, some cast him curious glances. Even in 2024, a black man in first class was rare enough to warrant notice, and Marcus had grown accustomed to the double takes. He had faced them throughout his career, an accomplished pilot, yet always having to prove himself. Today, however, he was determined to relax and let the world pass by, or so he thought. A flight attendant named Sarah, her blonde hair pulled back in a polished bun, approached. Her smile was professional, but failed to reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice measured. "I believe there may have been a mistake with your seating assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus blinked, momentarily confused. Nevertheless, he handed over his ticket without protest. Sarah examined it closely, her brow furrowing. She glanced between Marcus and the slip of paper. "I'm sorry, sir," she said with a tone that bordered on patronizing, "but this ticket is for first class. Unfortunately, we don't have any more seats available here. I'll need to ask you to move to economy." Stunned, Marcus felt a wave of incredulity wash over him. "I don't understand," he replied, keeping his voice calm and steady. "My ticket clearly shows that I'm seated in first class. Is there a problem with the booking system?" Sarah's smile grew taut. "There's no problem with the system, but this section is reserved for premium passengers," she said, the implication hanging heavily between them. Marcus took a breath, a tightness settling in his chest. He knew this moment. The crossroads of quiet compliance or standing firm. His years as a pilot had taught him restraint, but the sting of discrimination never fully dulled. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but I assure you I'm in the correct seat. Perhaps your supervisor can clarify." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm the lead flight attendant, sir," she replied, her irritation breaking through. "I need you to gather your belongings and move so we can board the remaining passengers." All around them, eyes began to turn. Curiosity and discomfort spread through the cabin like ripples on a lake. Marcus made a decision, one he knew might ripple far beyond this plane. With a heavy heart, he conceded for now. "Very well," he said, voice tight, "but I expect to speak to the captain before takeoff." Sarah nodded, visibly relieved as Marcus gathered his things. Little did she know, her actions were about to set a chain of events into motion, one that would challenge her assumptions and open the eyes of everyone on board. Marcus stood in the narrow aisle, clutching his carry-on bag as he was ushered back to economy class. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though he were trudging through an invisible quicksand of humiliation and frustration. Passengers in the rows he passed either averted their gaze or offered awkward smiles, their discomfort palpable. He found himself wedged into a middle seat near the back, a far cry from the plush luxury of first class. He sighed, adjusting his large frame into the cramped space, resigned yet simmering with a quiet indignation. Across the aisle, a young boy watched Marcus with wide, curious eyes. The child's mother gently pulled him back, whispering, "It's not polite to stare." Marcus managed a weary smile in the boy's direction, though he couldn't shake the weight pressing down on his chest. Settling into his seat, Marcus considered his options. He wasn't one to seek unnecessary conflict, but this felt different, blatant, painful, and all too familiar. he retrieved his phone and composed a quick email to the airline's customer service department, documenting the incident. If nothing else, he'd leave a record. The plane continued to fill up, and Marcus could hear snippets of conversation from first class carried back through the cabin. Words like mistake and misunderstanding floated in the air, but they cut deep, leaving no doubt about the assumptions that had been made. Minutes later, the announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 972, nonstop to Los Angeles. We'll be taxiing shortly, so please make sure all carry-on items are stowed and your seatbelts are securely fastened. The voice was confident, warm, and commanding. Marcus knew that voice. The flight captain, James Edwards, had been Marcus's close friend and mentor for over a decade. They had flown countless routes together, sharing dreams, struggles, and triumphs. In fact, Edwards had been one of the first people to encourage Marcus when he doubted his place in the world of aviation. The irony was almost laughable. Marcus took a breath, contemplating his next move. As the plane began to taxi, he knew confronting Captain Edwards would be a delicate balance. He had no desire to disrupt the flight or cause a scene, but he couldn't let this slide without a discussion. Just as he was mulling over his approach, Sarah appeared again, this time to do a final check. When she noticed Marcus, her face paled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" she asked, her tone now clipped with annoyance. Marcus held her gaze. "Yes, actually," he said calmly. "I'd still like to speak with the captain when he's available." Sarah hesitated, her professional veneer cracking for just a moment. "The captain is quite busy preparing for takeoff," she said, but Marcus caught the slight quaver in her voice. "I understand," Marcus replied. "I'll wait." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded and walked away, her posture stiff. Marcus knew she was probably dreading the conversation she'd soon have with Captain Edwards. In a way, he almost felt sorry for her, caught as she was between her ignorance and the truth she was about to learn. The plane accelerated, the engines roaring as it lifted off the ground. Marcus felt the familiar rush, the weightless sensation as the aircraft climbed into the sky. He closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. He had endured far worse in his career, but this felt personal, a scar ripped open by years of microaggressions and silent battles. Then, just as the flight leveled off, Sarah reappeared, looking more nervous than before. "Captain Edwards would like to see you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus glanced at her, reading the unease in her expression, before unbuckling his seatbelt and standing. He made his way toward the front, passing rows of passengers who now watched with heightened interest. When he reached the cockpit, Captain Edwards stood just outside the door, his blue eyes widening with surprise when he saw Marcus. "Marcus," Edwards said, his voice tinged with genuine shock and concern. "What on earth are you doing back here?" Marcus folded his arms, a tight, composed smile barely concealing his frustration. "I could ask the same of you, Captain," he replied, his voice steady but cutting. Edwards glanced at Sarah, who was now visibly squirming. "Sarah, would you mind giving us a moment?" he said, his tone polite but firm. She quickly retreated, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Once she was gone, Edwards turned his attention back to Marcus. "What happened?" the captain asked, concern etched into his features. Marcus inhaled deeply, recounting the incident in a controlled tone. He described how the flight attendant had refused to believe he was a first-class passenger, how she had accused him of trying to take someone else's seat, and how she had practically escorted him to the back of the plane. With each word, Edwards' face grew darker, his jaw tightening. "This is unacceptable," Edwards said, his voice low and angry. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'll handle this right now." Marcus held up a hand, stopping him. "James, wait," he said. "It's not just about an apology. It's about understanding why this happened in the first place." He paused, meeting his friend's eyes. "I know you mean well, but this isn't the first time, and it won't be the last unless something changes." Edwards seemed to deflate slightly, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "You're right," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "I can't fix what's already happened, but I can make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." The captain took a moment, clearly grappling with the implications. "Come with me," he said finally. He gestured for Marcus to follow him back into the cockpit. Once inside, Edwards closed the door behind them, shutting out the murmurs and curious eyes of the passengers. The small space was filled with the hum of the aircraft's instruments, and Marcus found himself surrounded by memories of flights past. The cockpit was a place of camaraderie, shared responsibility, and trust. Yet today, it felt like a battleground, a place where an unspoken war was being waged. Edward sat down in the captain's chair, gesturing for Marcus to take the co-pilot's seat. "Talk to me," he said quietly, his eyes searching Marcus's face. Marcus hesitated, feeling the weight of years of accumulated frustration and silent perseverance. "Do you know how often I've had to prove myself?" he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just as a pilot, but as a black man in a space where people still question if I belong." He swallowed hard. "I worked twice as hard for half the recognition, James. And today, when that flight attendant saw me in first class, she assumed the worst." Edwards listened intently, his expression shifting between sadness and anger. "I didn't realize," he said, his voice rough with regret. I knew there were challenges, but I didn't understand how deep it ran." Marcus leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly. "Most people don't," he said, "and I've kept quiet for a long time, but I'm tired, James. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt. It's not enough to just be sorry. We need to do better. All of us." The captain nodded, his gaze steady. "You're right," he said, "and I promise I won't let this slide." He reached for the intercom, his hand hovering over the button. "I need to address the crew and the passengers. They need to hear the truth." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "You sure about that?" he asked, surprised by Edwards's boldness. Edwards nodded firmly. "Absolutely," he said. "If we're going to change things, it starts with accountability." He pressed the button, his voice ringing out over the plane's intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Edwards speaking," he began, his tone calm but resolute. "I'd like to take a moment to address something important. Earlier today, there was an incident involving one of our passengers, Mr. Marcus Johnson, who was wrongly escorted from first class to economy. Mr. Johnson is not only a respected passenger, but also a highly skilled pilot and a close colleague of mine. The treatment he received was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that we learn from this and do better in the future." The plane fell into a stunned silence, every passenger hanging on to the captain's words. Marcus felt a swell of emotion, a complex mix of gratitude and disbelief. Edwards continued, "Discrimination and prejudice have no place in our skies or anywhere else. To Mr. Johnson, I offer my sincerest apologies, and I promise that this will be addressed thoroughly with our airline's leadership. Thank you for listening." He released the button, the intercom cutting off with a small click. The cabin remained hushed, the weight of the message sinking in. Marcus felt his throat tighten, the unexpected vulnerability of the moment pressing against his chest. He turned to Edwards, who met his gaze with a solemn nod. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice trembling just a bit. Edwards reached out, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder. "It's a start," he replied, "but there's more work to do." For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to hope. As the intercom clicked off, a ripple of reaction passed through the cabin. Marcus could see heads turning, passengers whispering to one another. The flight attendants looked shocked, their eyes wide and uncertain. The weight of what had just happened seemed to hang in the air, charged with the undeniable significance of the captain's announcement. Edwards turned to Marcus, a mix of determination and uncertainty in his expression. "I meant what I said," he affirmed. "This isn't going to get buried." Marcus nodded, feeling a small, flickering flame of hope inside him. He stood, straightening his shoulders. "I appreciate that, James, more than you know." Before Marcus could return to his seat, the cockpit door opened, and Sarah, the flight attendant who had started the whole incident, stood there, her face pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked between Marcus and Edwards. "Captain, Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice hesitant and shaky. I need to apologize." Marcus studied her, his gaze steady but not unkind. Sarah's discomfort was obvious, her eyes brimming with guilt and confusion. "I'm so sorry," she continued, her voice cracking. I made assumptions I had no right to make. I didn't even give you a chance to explain. I'm ashamed of how I treated you." The sincerity in her voice took Marcus by surprise. He had encountered countless moments of prejudice and condescension over the years, but genuine, heartfelt apologies were rare. He could see she was struggling to make sense of her actions, her own biases now laid bare before her. Marcus took a deep breath, his heart thumping in his chest. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, his voice calm and composed. "I won't pretend it didn't hurt, but acknowledging it is a first step." Sarah swallowed, her eyes misting. "I'll do better," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I owe you that." Marcus inclined his head, feeling the tiniest easing of the burden he carried. Change was slow, often frustratingly so, but every step mattered. He watched as Sarah retreated, visibly moved, and then made his way back to his first-class seat. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Several passengers who had overheard the captain's message and witnessed the apology offered Marcus small nods of support. One older woman even leaned over the aisle as he passed. "It's about time someone stood up and said something," she murmured, her eyes kind. Marcus managed a grateful smile, the support warming him. He settled into his seat, finally allowing himself to take a full breath. Yet as he gazed out the window at the endless expanse of sky, he knew this wasn't the end of the journey. It was simply another waypoint. As the flight progressed, Marcus found himself deep in thought. Memories of past struggles surfaced, moments where he had chosen silence over confrontation, knowing that speaking up often came at a cost. Today had been different, a moment of truth not just for him, but for everyone aboard. A tap on his shoulder pulled him from his reverie. Marcus turned to see a young boy standing in the aisle, clutching a small toy airplane. His mother hovered nearby, a mixture of nerves and encouragement on her face. "Hi," the boy said, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you really a pilot?" Marcus's heart softened and he smiled warmly. "Yes, I am," he replied. "I fly planes just like this one." The boy's eyes lit up. "That's so cool. I want to be a pilot when I grow up," he declared, his voice filled with innocent determination. Marcus felt a swell of emotion, realizing the profound importance of representation, of being seen. "You can be anything you want to be," he told the boy, his voice full of conviction. "And I hope you do become a pilot. The skies are better when they belong to all of us." The boy grinned, clutching his toy tighter, before his mother gently guided him back to their seats. Marcus watched them go, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe today's events would ripple outward, making a difference in ways he couldn't yet see. As the plane began its descent into New York, Marcus braced himself for what awaited on the ground. The captain's announcement had undoubtedly stirred conversations, and the airline's leadership would need to address it. But Marcus felt steadier now, buoyed by the support and understanding he had witnessed. When the aircraft landed and taxied to the gate, Edwards came over the intercom one final time. "Thank you for flying with us today," he said, his voice warm but with a hint of gravitas. "Let's remember that every journey, even a routine flight, is an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to make things better." The plane erupted into the usual bustle of passengers gathering their belongings, but this time the energy felt different, more reflective, perhaps a little more connected. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he was greeted by Edwards once again, who stood by the cockpit door. "I meant what I said," the captain reiterated, offering his hand. "We're in this together." Marcus took his hand, feeling the firm grip of solidarity. "Let's make sure of it," he said, and with that, Marcus walked into the airport terminal, carrying with him not just the weight of the past, but a renewed hope for the future. One flight at a time, one conversation at a time, the world could indeed change. Marcus took a deep breath, the cool air of the terminal feeling almost like a fresh start. As he made his way through the bustling crowd, his mind churned with thoughts. The flight had been a microcosm of the world he navigated daily, a world where every step forward required courage, but also where hope could flourish in the unlikeliest places. Before he could reflect further, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a notification from his email. Curious, he stopped by a nearby seating area and opened the message. It was from a journalist who had been a fellow passenger on the flight, someone he hadn't even noticed amid the tension. The email was succinct but powerful. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I witnessed what happened today. Your composure, your dignity, and your insistence on fairness moved me deeply. I'm interested in telling your story, the story of a pilot who stands up for himself and, in doing so, shines a light on the changes our world desperately needs. If you're willing, I'd love to speak with you. Sincerely, Olivia Clark, The Times. Marcus stared at the email, a wave of surprise washing over him. He had grown so used to silence, to his experiences being dismissed or minimized. Yet here was someone who wanted to amplify his voice, to bring attention to what had transpired. The idea was both exhilarating and daunting. He knew that agreeing to share his story would open him up to public scrutiny. It might spark further backlash, but it could also ignite conversations, perhaps even drive change on a larger scale. Marcus's fingers hovered over his phone, debating whether he was ready for this. But before he could decide, a familiar voice called his name. He looked up to see his mother, Helen Johnson, standing a few paces away. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Marcus's heart swelled. She had come to meet him, as she often did when he landed in New York. "Mom," he greeted, breaking into a smile as he approached her. They embraced, and for a moment, the whirlwind of emotions stilled. Helen pulled back slightly, studying his face with a mother's intuition. "Rough flight?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you could say that." He didn't need to explain everything. His mother knew the world he faced, the challenges and triumphs he carried. She gave his hand a squeeze. "You're stronger than they know," she said, her eyes fierce with pride. "And you've got people who believe in you." Marcus felt his resolve solidify. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, and maybe he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate what came next. But he knew he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't let moments like today pass without giving them the weight they deserved. He pulled his phone back out, opened the email from Olivia Clark, and hit reply. His message was short, but it carried the weight of his decision. "Thank you for reaching out. I'd be honored to share my story." As Marcus and his mother walked out of the airport together, he felt something shift inside him. The world was still imperfect, still filled with struggles, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was walking towards something rather than away. And that was enough to make the journey worth every step.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.